December 1988, Seattle. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and the Crocodile Cafe smelled like stale beer and wet flannel. Inside the cramped venue, maybe 40 people scattered across mismatched chairs, most of them nursing cheap drinks and waiting for something to happen. Marcus Webb adjusted his expensive watch and checked his phone messages. As A&R scout for Atlantic Records, he'd flown up from Los Angeles specifically to witness what industry insiders were calling the Seattle explosion. Grunge was becoming a whisper in major label boardrooms. Someone upstairs wanted him to find the next big thing before it got too big to afford. 3 local bands were scheduled that night. The first 2 had been forgettable, competent but derivative, trying too hard to sound like somebody else. Webb was already planning his early flight back to LAX when a thin blonde kid in a thrift store cardigan walked to the microphone. "We're Nirvana," Kurt Cobain said quietly, adjusting his battered Fender Mustang. No theatrics, no crowd-warming banter, just those 2 words hanging in the smoky air. What happened next lasted exactly 18 minutes. 18 minutes of raw, unfiltered sound that seemed to channel every frustration brewing in the American underground. Kurt's voice cracked and soared, never quite where you expected it to be. Chris Novoselic's bass lines walked a perfect line between melody and chaos. Chad Channing's drums hit with precision that felt almost accidental. When they finished, the small crowd erupted. Not polite applause, genuine, startled enthusiasm from people who'd just witnessed something they couldn't quite name. Webb watched from the back, making notes on his phone. Interesting energy, raw talent, but completely unpolished. These kids had no idea what they were dealing with. After the set, Webb found his way backstage, which consisted of a storage closet behind the bar that doubled as a green room. Kurt was sitting on a beer crate, tuning his guitar by ear, seemingly unaware that he'd just played one of the most compelling sets Webb had heard all year. "Kurt Cobain?" Webb extended his hand, flashing his practiced industry smile. "Marcus Webb, Atlantic Records. Impressive set tonight." Kurt looked up, shook the offered hand without much enthusiasm. "Thanks. I'd like to talk business with you guys. You've got something special here, but it's going to need some serious development before it's ready for the big leagues." Chris Novoselic had wandered over, still sweating from the stage. "What kind of development?" Webb leaned against the wall, settling into his pitch. He'd given this speech dozens of times to dozens of hopeful bands. "Look, you guys have talent, real talent, but talent without proper presentation is just noise. A real album, I'm talking major label quality, requires serious investment. Professional studios, experienced producers, marketing campaigns. We're looking at 50,000 minimum, probably closer to 75 for a full package." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "What you played tonight was good for a local club, but if you want to compete with Guns N' Roses, with Metallica, with the bands that actually sell records, you need to think bigger. Much bigger." Kurt continued tuning his guitar, head down, fingers working methodically through each string. He hadn't said a word since the handshake. "The industry doesn't mess around with amateur hour," Webb continued. "Studio time at a decent facility runs $300 an hour minimum. A good producer wants 15 to 20,000 up front. Marketing, distribution, video production, it all adds up fast. But that's what separates the professionals from the weekend warriors." Chris was getting visibly irritated. "So you're saying—" Kurt looked up for the first time since Webb had started talking. His blue eyes were calm, almost absent. "Thanks for listening tonight," he said simply. "We'll think about it." Webb handed over his business card. "Don't think too long. Windows close fast in this business." He glanced around the makeshift green room, taking in the concrete walls and exposed pipes. "You guys obviously love music, but love doesn't pay for studio time." 3 weeks later, Kurt was standing in the lobby of Reciprocal Recording, a converted house in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood. Jack Endino, the studio's owner-operator, greeted him with a firm handshake and a slight smile. "So you want to make an album?" Endino said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Kurt shifted his guitar case to his other hand. "How much would that cost?" Endino scratched his beard, considering. "Depends what you're looking for. Full album, 10 to 12 tracks, mix and basic mastering included. I could do it for 600, maybe a little more if you want extra time. $600, Webb's words echoed in Kurt's head. 50,000 minimum. 600 total? Plus tax. Call it 606 and change. Kurt nodded, slowly. When can we start? Next week work for you? The recording sessions began on December 24th, 1988. While most of Seattle was celebrating Christmas Eve, Kurt, Chris, and Chad were setting up instruments in Endino's converted living room studio. The space felt more like a basement rehearsal room than a professional recording facility. Carpet samples covered the walls for sound treatment. The mixing board looked like it had survived the 1970s barely intact. Outside, snow was falling on Georgetown's industrial landscape. Inside the studio, the heater struggled against December's bite, creating a constant low hum that somehow became part of the recording's atmosphere. Kurt seemed unaffected by the cold, or maybe he was drawing energy from it. He moved through the cramped space with quiet purpose, repositioning his amp until it sat exactly where he wanted it. Most bands come in here trying to sound like somebody else, Endino observed, watching Kurt tune his Mustang with methodical precision. They want to recreate what they heard on the radio, but you guys sound like yourselves. Kurt looked up briefly. We don't know how to sound like anyone else. There was something almost monk-like about Kurt's preparation. No nervous energy, no pre-performance rituals. He simply plugged in and waited, as if the songs were already there, hanging in the air, and all he had to do was reach out and grab them. Endino had been documenting Seattle's underground music scene for years, recording everyone from Soundgarden to Mudhoney on budgets that wouldn't cover lunch at a major label studio. He'd developed his own approach. Capture the performance, not the perfection. Most bands want to fix everything in post, Endino explained as they set levels. Punch in every mistake, layer on effects until the original performance disappears. But sometimes the mistakes are what make it real. Kurt plugged his Mustang into a battered Fender amplifier and played a few chords. The sound was raw, immediate. No elaborate effects chains, no studio trickery, just wood and wire and electricity. Sounds good, Kurt said. They recorded Blue in 2 takes. Not because the first take was perfect, but because the second take captured something the first one missed. Kurt's vocal cracked on the high notes, but the crack felt intentional, like he was channeling something too big for his voice to contain. You want to try that again? Endino asked from the control room. Kurt shook his head. It's right. Floyd the Barber took 3 takes, but only because Chris's bass string snapped during take 2. School was 1 take, live, with Kurt singing and playing simultaneously. No overdubs, no corrections, no safety net. By the end of the first day, they'd recorded 6 songs. In major label terms, they'd accomplished what should have taken a week. This is moving fast, Endino commented during a break. The songs are done, Kurt replied. We just need to record them. It was an attitude that would have horrified Marcus Webb. Where was the careful preparation, the endless tweaking, the pursuit of sonic perfection that justified those $50,000 budgets? But as the sessions progressed, something remarkable was happening. Without the pressure of expensive studio time, without the expectation of commercial perfection, Nirvana was capturing something pure. These weren't polished recordings. They were documents of a band in their natural state. Kurt's guitar tone was deliberately crude, all mid-range in grain. His vocals alternated between whispered vulnerability and full-throated roar, often within the same line. Chris' bass provided melodic counterpoint while anchoring the low end. Chad's drums sounded live, present, like he was playing in your garage. Negative Creep emerged as a 2-minute blast of controlled chaos. Swap Meet built from a simple riff into something hypnotic and strange. Mr. Mustache attacked with punk aggression, but revealed pop sensibilities underneath the noise. On the final day of recording, they tackled About a Girl, Kurt's most obviously melodic song. Some bands would have saved it for last, wanting to end on a high note. Kurt placed it strategically in the running order, using melody as contrast rather than climax. That's a different side of you guys, Endino observed after they'd nailed the take. It's all the same side, Kurt said, just different angles. The mixing process took 2 more days. Indino worked with the band to balance the elements, but they weren't trying to fix anything fundamental. The performances were what they were. The job was simply to present them clearly. When they heard the final mixes, Kurt nodded with satisfaction. "That's us," he said. The album was mastered at a different facility for an additional $40. Total cost, $606.17. Sub Pop Records agreed to release the album based on a rough cassette mix. They pressed 1,000 copies initially, not expecting much beyond local interest. Bleach hit the underground like a seismic event. College radio stations picked up Blue and About a Girl immediately. The sound was simultaneously familiar and completely fresh, recognizably rock and roll, but unlike anything currently on the radio. Fanzines that usually ignored Seattle began writing about Nirvana. Record stores couldn't keep copies in stock. Within 6 months, those initial 1,000 copies had sold through multiple pressings. European distributors were calling Sub Pop, wanting to license the album overseas. British music magazines that had never covered American underground bands were writing features about the Seattle sound. Marcus Webb first heard Bleach in his Atlantic Records office in early 1990. His assistant had brought him a stack of underground releases that were generating industry buzz. "This is that band from Seattle you checked out," she said, dropping the album on his desk. "They made this for $600. Webb stared at the crude black and white cover art. No glossy production photos, no major label polish. It looked like exactly what it was, an independent release made on a shoestring budget. He dropped the needle on Blue. The sound that emerged from his office speakers stopped him mid-sentence in a phone call he was making to another A&R scout. This wasn't amateur hour. This was devastating. Track after track, Bleach delivered what Webb's $50,000 signings had been failing to achieve. Authenticity. These weren't songs crafted to fit radio formats or demographic studies. They were simply honest expressions of whatever Kurt Cobain was feeling when he wrote them. By the time Mr. Mustache faded out, Webb was sitting in silence, staring at his phone. On his desk sat contracts for 3 bands Atlantic had signed in the past year. Combined recording budgets, over $300,000. Combined album sales, barely 50,000 units. He picked up one of the contracts, scanning the itemized expenses. Studio rental, $45,000. Producer fee, $30,000. Mixing, $15,000. The numbers that had once seemed like necessary investments now felt absurd. What had all that money actually bought? Perfection that nobody wanted to hear. Bleach had sold over 100,000 copies and was still climbing. 2 years later, Nirvana's major label debut, Nevermind, exploded into mainstream consciousness, making Kurt Cobain one of the most famous musicians in the world. Suddenly, everyone wanted to understand how this band had emerged from nowhere to define a generation. The story always led back to Bleach, the $600 album that proved talent and honesty mattered more than budget and polish. In 1995, at a music industry conference in New York, Marcus Webb found himself on a panel discussing A&R strategy for the changing market. The moderator asked about his biggest professional regret. Webb paused, considering his words carefully. "In 1988, I met a young band in Seattle. Talented kids, but completely unpolished. I told them they needed $50,000 minimum to make a real album. That band was Nirvana." The audience shifted in their seats, recognizing where this was going. 8 months later, they recorded Bleach for $606. It became one of the most influential albums of the decade. Meanwhile, I was signing bands and spending $100,000 on albums that nobody remembers. He looked out at the room full of industry professionals, many of whom were probably making the same mistakes he'd made. "Bleach taught me something about this business that I'd forgotten. Music isn't about having the biggest budget or the most expensive equipment. It's about having something true to say and the courage to say it honestly." Kurt Cobain had that courage. I was too busy counting dollars to recognize it. The room was silent for a moment before the moderator moved on to the next question. After the panel, a young A&R scout approached Webb. "Do you think you would have signed Nirvana if you'd heard Bleach first?" Webb considered the question. "Honestly, probably not. It would have sounded too raw, too unfinished. I would have wanted them to work with an expensive producer, polish the rough edges, make it more commercially viable. I would have turned their greatest strength into their biggest weakness. What changed your mind about underground music? Kurt Cobain proved that limitations can be liberating. When you don't have $50,000 to fix every imperfection, you're forced to get it right the first time. You're forced to be honest. And honesty, it turns out, is what people were hungry for. The scout nodded, taking notes. Any advice for finding the next Nirvana? Webb smiled, remembering that rainy December night in Seattle. Stop looking for what you think people want to hear. Start listening for what people need to hear. The difference is everything. Today, Bleach stands as one of music's great examples of doing more with less. Not because it sounds cheap, but because it sounds honest. Kurt Cobain took Marcus Webb's dismissive challenge and turned it into proof that authenticity doesn't require a big budget. It requires courage. The $600 album that changed everything.